The silence was worse than the laughter. 1, 2, 3 seconds. I counted every heartbeat as it hammered against my ribs, begging me to run. But my feet wouldn't move. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. And Nolan's voice, the voice I had pressed my ear to his chest 100 times just to hear, that voice didn't tremble for even a second. I, Nolan, reject Kayla as my fated mate. That was it. Clean, final. Like signing a death warrant for something he'd never once fought to save. The Great Hall of Aldenmore held over 1,000 wolves. Council members in their slate-gray ceremonial sashes. Pack warriors lining the walls like carved stone. Elders whose opinions had always mattered more than breath itself. Every single one of them heard it. Every single one of them watched me flinch. I was wearing a gown I spent 3 years making with my own hands. Ivory thread, bone needle stitching, silver embroidery at the hem. I had sewn every inch of it dreaming of this ceremony, the claiming. The moment a fated mate bond was publicly honored before the kingdom. Instead, it became a shroud. He didn't just leave me standing there. He turned, straightened his collar, and knelt before Lydia, a council-born female whose future had been arranged beside his long before I ever arrived. The crowd erupted. Applause. Relief, even. As if my existence had been nothing more than an inconvenient detour on the way to the right answer. I tasted salt on my lips and realized, dully, that I was crying. I had never felt so completely erased. And then, the laughter died. Not gradually. All at once. Like someone had pressed a hand over the mouth of the entire room. A shadow crossed the threshold. Cold. Still. Absolute. I looked up through my tears, and everything stopped. It wasn't just an alpha, it was the king. And he wasn't looking at Nolan, he was looking at me. There are stories people tell about the day everything changed for them. They remember the weather. The exact slant of light through a window. The smell of the air before the moment split their life into before and after. This is my story. And the day everything changed for me was the worst day I had ever lived. I grew up on the edge of Aldenmore territory. The kind of edge that makes it clear you are not quite part of the center. My mother was a low-rank she-wolf who had been quietly overlooked her entire life. My father had never claimed her publicly. I was their daughter. And in a world where bloodlines determine your worth, that made me, from the very beginning, something the kingdom called unclaimable. Not dangerous, not cursed, just overlooked. Wolves like me don't get chosen at claiming ceremonies. We don't sit in the front rows. We don't carry names people remember. I learned early that the only way to survive in a world that had already decided your value was to be useful, to be quiet, to make myself small enough that people stopped noticing the space I took up. And then the fates made a mistake. Or so Nolan told himself. When the bond recognition hit us both at the autumn borderline gathering 3 years ago, he looked at me like something had gone terribly wrong. Like the universe had glitched and assigned him the wrong prize. He never once held my hand in public. Never once spoke my name to the council. But I stayed. Because I was unclaimable. And a fated bond felt like proof that even I could be chosen. I was wrong. The claiming ceremony was supposed to be the day I stopped apologizing for existing. It became something else entirely. But here is what I know now that I didn't know then. The worst thing that ever happened to me was also the first true thing that ever happened to me. If you're new here, welcome to Adeline's Story Vault. This is where stories don't just entertain you. They stay with you. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Now let's get back to Kayla, because it's about to get interesting. The hall had been decorated for weeks. Aldenmore's claiming hall was the oldest structure in the territory, stone arches worn smooth by generations of ceremony, moonstone lanterns lining every pillar, their light falling across the floor in cool silver ribbons. It was beautiful. It always had been. And tonight, dressed for something that was supposed to be mine, it felt like standing inside a painting I had no right to be in. I had arrived early. That was the kind of thing I did. Arrived early, stood quietly, tried not to take up too much room. Zoe, my oldest friend and the only wolf at Aldenmore who had ever treated me like I was worth something, had braided white flowers into my hair that morning. She'd clasped my hands between hers and looked at me with that particular worried gentleness I'd always misread as nerves. "You look beautiful, Kayla," she'd said. And then softer, "You deserve to be happy." I hadn't understood why she'd emphasized that word. Deserve. As if it were something in question. I understood later. The ceremony began at dusk. The hall filled quickly. Pack members finding their seats, council elders arranging themselves at the high table, the low drone of formality settling over everything like fog. I stood in the preparation antechamber, alone, smoothing the front of my gown with both palms, and telling myself to breathe. When the doors opened and I walked out, I searched for Nolan's face. He was standing at the ceremonial altar, flanked by 2 members of his inner circle. Declan stood on his left, a broad-shouldered wolf who had never once looked at me directly in 3 years. Not out of rudeness exactly, but out of that deliberate kind of avoidance that has a reason behind it. On Nolan's right stood Maverick. He was watching my approach with an expression too careful to be casual, tracking me the way you track something you've been assigned to monitor. I had always told myself his attention made me uncomfortable because he was arrogant. Standing there, walking toward the altar in my ivory gown, I finally identified what it actually was. He was calculating. I filed it away and focused on Nolan. He was dressed in deep charcoal, his dark hair cut close, his jaw set hard. He looked like a man bracing for a procedure, not a ceremony. His eyes were fixed somewhere above my head, on the far wall, as if he were reading a script written there in a language only he could see. I told myself it was nerves. The elder began the formal invocation, that slow rolling chant that had opened every claiming for 500 years. The crowd held its breath. Even the torch flames seemed to pull inward, as if listening. I watched Nolan's face the entire time. He did not look at me once. The elder finished and nodded. Nolan stepped forward, and something inside me, some small, foolish, threadbare thing I had been protecting for 3 years, cracked open with hope. He opened his mouth. I, Nolan, reject Kayla as my fated mate. The world didn't end. That was the strange thing. The lanterns kept burning. The moonstone kept glowing. Air kept moving in and out of my lungs through some automatic cruelty of biology that didn't care about the size of the moment. The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then the ripple moved through the crowd. That collective processing. 1,000 wolves absorbing what they'd just heard and rearranging their faces accordingly. The bond fracturing hurt in a way I had no language for. Not like a wound, like erasure, like a word being struck from a page, leaving only the indent of where it used to be. I stood very still because falling was not an option. I had learned early that showing weakness in public was an invitation, not a shelter. But my hands were shaking. Nolan turned without looking at me. He crossed to where Lydia stood on the right side of the altar, composed, council-born, already moving toward him with the practiced ease of someone who had known this was coming for a long time. She wore dark green. Her gold hair was pinned up. She looked like the right answer to a question that had never included me. He knelt. He spoke her name. He made his choice. The crowd responded with the kind of relief you only feel from people who had been quietly hoping for a specific outcome. Applause. exhales, the low murmur of approval threading through every row like water finding its level. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I was still standing at the altar in a gown I had stitched by hand for 3 years. Thread by thread, dream by dream. Every stitch a version of a future I had allowed myself to want. Zoe appeared at my side, her hand closing around my elbow. Steadying, urgent. Without that anchor, I think I might have simply dissolved where I stood. Then the laughter started. Not from everyone. From enough. The low, knowing kind, not directed at me exactly, but at the idea of me. At the idea that someone unclaimable had stood at that altar and genuinely believed. Of course, it said. Of course. I closed my eyes, and the laughter stopped. Not gradually, completely. The way every sound in a forest stops when something large moves through it and displaces the air. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The collective animal instinct of 1,000 wolves orienting toward a single point. The ancient recognition that lives below thought, below rank, below every learned behavior. Something that exists above all of it has just entered this space. I opened my eyes. He stood in the entrance of the hall, alone. No escort, no announcement, no ceremony surrounding his arrival. He was simply present. The way stone is present, the way deep water is present, in a way that makes everything else measure itself against the fact of him. Tall, broad-shouldered beneath a dark coat fastened at the collar with iron. Black hair, close cut. A jaw that looked like it had been decided rather than grown. And eyes, storm gray edged with something green, utterly and completely still. Scanning nothing. Acknowledging nothing in the room. Trained on me. He was the king of the high court. Onyx, Nolan's sovereign. The sovereign of every wolf breathing in that hall. And he was looking at me with an expression I had no category for. Not pity. Not assessment. Not the particular measuring look of a powerful male cataloging something beneath him. Something older than all of those. Something that, in the wreckage of the worst moment of my life, felt, impossibly, inexplicably, like recognition. Zoe's grip on my elbow became a vice. The elder had gone pale. Nolan turned, and for the first time that night, something crossed his face that wasn't cold certainty. Something smaller. The beginning of a feeling he hadn't planned for. Onyx crossed the hall. Unhurried. Silent on stone. He stopped 3 feet from me. He looked at me, only me, and said in a voice quiet enough to be private and precise enough to carry to every corner of that hall, "What is your name?" I had been asked that question 100 times. It had always felt like a formality. A box to check before someone's attention moved on. It had never once sounded like this. Like the answer was the entire point. "Kayla," I said. He nodded. Once, slow, the way someone nods when a suspicion becomes a certainty. Then he turned and looked at Nolan. And Nolan, for the first time in his life, looked genuinely small. No one moved. That was the thing about power at a certain scale. It didn't need to assert itself. It simply occupied space, and everything else rearranged around it. Onyx had done nothing yet except cross a hall and ask a woman her name. And Nolan had gone gray. Then Onyx spoke. "You're dismissed." 2 words. The same quiet tone. And the entire ceremony, the rejection, the declaration, Lydia at his side, the crowd's applause. All of it became, in an instant, something that had happened in a room the king had just stepped into and decided was finished. Declan and Maverick exchanged a look. Neither moved. I caught Maverick's face in that exchange and saw something specific. Not shock, but recalculation. like a man running numbers and arriving at an outcome he hadn't expected. He had known the king might eventually take an interest in me. That much was clear from how carefully he'd been watching all evening. He had not modeled this particular night, or what Onyx would do when he arrived. I stored that too. Nolan found his voice. "My king, the ceremony has already..." I know what the ceremony was. Onyx didn't look at him. "And I know what it is now. Finished." Nolan closed his mouth. Lydia, to her credit, took a half-step backward. She had enough political instinct to understand that whatever was happening did not involve her, and that the wisest thing she could do was make herself architecturally irrelevant. Onyx turned back to me. I was operating, at that point, from some detached functional layer of myself, the part that could still form words and keep my spine straight while the rest of me was still standing at the altar, hearing I reject Kayla in a voice that didn't shake. "You're coming with me," he said. Not a question. Not a command delivered with Nolan's particular edge of impatience. Just a statement of what was going to happen, offered with the same matter-of-fact quality as weather. I looked at him directly. Why? The hall made a collective sound. Zoe's hand tightened on my elbow hard enough to bruise. I understood dimly that asking why to the king of the high court in front of his court was not protocol. I also understood that I was standing in the ruins of the worst moment of my life and had very little left to protect. Something moved in Onyx's expression, not irritation. The opposite. Something that looked briefly, unmistakably, like appreciation. "Because you are owed more than this hall gave you tonight," he said. "And because I intend to explain that to you properly." I held his gaze for a moment. Then, "All right." He had an escort waiting outside. 2 high court warriors flanking a black carriage marked with an iron sigil I didn't recognize. Everything about it was efficient and unhurried, as if the sequence of events in the hall had been anticipated long before tonight. I sat across from him as the carriage moved northeast, Aldenmore falling away behind us through the window. My gown was folded wrong around me, and the remnants of my flower braid had started coming apart. I was acutely aware of how I looked, like someone who had dressed for triumph and received catastrophe instead. Onyx sat with one arm resting along the carriage door, watching the forest as the tree line moved past. The moonlight came through the window in a long silver bar across the seat between us. He didn't speak immediately. That silence was different from every silence I had been trained to fill. It didn't press. It didn't expect anything. It was simply present, and then it passed, and when he spoke, it felt like the right time for words. "You didn't cry," he said. An observation. Nothing more. "I did," I said. "You arrived after." He turned from the window and his gaze moved over my face with careful attention. Reading, I realized, the way some people read a room before they speak in it. "You were still standing when I got there." I didn't have anywhere to fall. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the expression of someone who has just heard something that confirms a prior belief. I looked out at the passing trees. Then I said the only true thing I had left. "I don't know why you came tonight. I don't know what any of this is. But I need you to understand. I'm not someone who falls apart and needs to be collected. Whatever this is, I want to understand it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you're not," he said. "That's part of why I came." "That's not an explanation." "No." His voice was even. "It isn't. Not yet." He paused, looking back at the window. "But it will be." I turned that over, let it rest, looked back at the dark forest and the strip of moon above the canopy, and allowed myself, for a few minutes, to simply not push. The High Court compound was built into the base of a mountain range an hour's ride northeast, pale stone rising from the rock face, as if it had grown there rather than been placed. Iron archways wound with dark vine. Torch fire glowing amber from within. It was nothing like Aldenmore's manicured formality. It felt older, more deliberate, like something that had been making decisions for a very long time. A she-wolf named Ellis brought me warm water and clean clothes and offered nothing but a brief, genuine nod when she set them down. I was grateful for her economy. I sat at the high window afterward and looked down at the training ground 3 stories below. Empty, silver-lit, the packed earth still carrying boot impressions and sparring lines from the day's work. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass. I had been publicly rejected by my fated mate and brought to the high court by its king on the same night. I had absolutely no map for what came next. I let myself, in the privacy of 4 stone walls, feel the full weight of it. Not just the rejection, the thing beneath it, that old, specific fear that the people who had seen me clearly and still looked away were correct, that even the fates had made a mistake with me that someone had needed to fix. The worst part was the small, stubborn part of me that still wanted Nolan to appear and say he'd been wrong. I hated that part intensely. A knock at the door. Not heavy, deliberate. Yes? Onyx stood in the frame, still in his dark coat, a rolled document in one hand. "I thought you'd still be awake," he said. "I told you I wasn't sleeping." I crossed the room and took what he held out. Old paper, stiff at the edges, sealed with an emblem I'd never seen before. A wolf mid-stride beneath a crescent moon, surrounded by a ring of stars arranged in a configuration that felt almost like script. Like letters in a language I'd forgotten I knew. My fingers registered something when they closed around it. A low warmth through the paper. Faint. Like holding something that had once been kept close to a body for a very long time. I looked up at him. "What is this?" "The beginning," he said, "of who you actually are." He stepped back, closed the door quietly. I stood in the center of the stone chamber, holding a document that weighed more than it should, and understood, without yet knowing why, that the worst day of my life had just stopped being only that. Something had changed. I didn't yet know how completely. I didn't sleep. I unrolled the document on the writing table and smoothed it flat, the old paper crackling softly at the crease lines. The torchlight made the ink look reddish, like writing done close to fire. At the top, in the formal court script of old Aldenmore, Protector line, primary genealogical record, sealed by order of the first king. Below it, a column of names, dates that stretched back before anything in living memory. Surnames I didn't recognize. And then, near the bottom, one I did. My mother's name, and below it, mine. I sat very still for a long time. The Protector line was a story. The old wolves mentioned it the way they mentioned the first moon, with that particular reverence people reserve for things they believe are gone and therefore safe to admire. The Protectors had been, in the oldest accounts, the spiritual custodians of the kingdom's founding bloodline. Not warriors, not politicians. Something harder to categorize. Wolves born with a perception that went deeper than instinct. An ability to read the bond health of a pack the way some people read weather. To sense fractures before they became fault lines. To feel corruption before it hardened into structure. The official record said the bloodline had simply died out in the 5th generation. The document on my table said the official record was a lie. I stayed at the table until the torch burned low, reading every line 3 times. Then I sat back and stared at the stone ceiling and thought about every time someone at Aldenmore had said the word unclaimable in my direction. Had let it settle on me like a natural fact. Like something I had earned. I had not been overlooked because I was nothing. I had been kept invisible because someone who understood what I carried could not afford for me to understand it too. Onyx was already in the reading chamber when I found it at dawn. A high-ceilinged room with shelves carved into the stone walls. the air carrying the particular stillness of old paper and unhurried time. He sat at the long center table, a second document spread open before him, a ceramic cup near his right hand. He didn't look up when I entered. "I wasn't sure if you'd sleep," he said. "I told you I wouldn't." He looked up. His gaze moved over my face. Careful, not invasive. Reading whatever the night had left there. "You read all of it?" "3 times. I took the chair across from him. "How long have you known?" "About the bloodline surviving?" He leaned back. "My predecessor's predecessor suspected it. I confirmed it the year I took the crown, 7 years ago. Your mother's records were cross-referenced with the oldest genealogical archive in the kingdom." He paused. "Finding you specifically took longer." "Because I was at Aldenmore." "Because you had been buried inside Aldenmore." The word was precise and deliberate. Buried, not lost. That was not an accident. The floor seemed to shift slightly beneath me. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands on the table. "Nolan's family has held Aldenmore's pack leadership for 6 generations. Passed down through their inner council, generation to generation, was a standing directive. If a protector bloodline wolf surfaced inside their territory, she was to be kept low. No formal record, no rank acknowledgement, no path toward visibility, just managed until the right moment to remove her from the board entirely." The word "managed" landed like a hand pressed against a bruise. "The rejection was planned," I said. "The rejection was the exit strategy." His voice remained even, but something had tightened behind it. A protector line wolf properly mated and publicly claimed inside Aldenmore would have drawn the High Court's formal attention within a year. Nolan's counsel had positioned Lydia's family at Aldenmore 3 years ago. The same 3 years you spent believing the bond was real. 3 years. The same 3 years I had spent sewing ivory thread into a gown, stitch by stitch, dreaming of a future that was never going to be offered to me. I let that settle. Let it find the shape it needed to take. The anger, when it came, didn't feel like fire. It felt like clarity, like a lens finally grinding itself into focus after years of blur. "Maverick," I said. Onyx's expression confirmed it before he spoke. "Placed inside the High Court as a formal council liaison 18 months ago. By then, Nolan's counsel had already anticipated that I was getting close to confirming the bloodline's survival. Maverick's assignment was to monitor the investigation from inside the court. Delay it. Redirect it. Report back to Aldenmore. He has been embedded here, working against this court from within it. And you've known. I've suspected. What I've lacked is proof of the full internal network. Which members of this court were coordinating with him, what was being transmitted, and when." He looked at me steadily. "I've been waiting for the structure to reveal itself from the inside." I thought about Maverick at the altar last night. That calculating expression when he watched me approach. The specific recalculation I'd seen flash across his face when Onyx walked in. Not surprise at the king's arrival, but surprise at what the king did when he got there. Maverick had known Onyx might eventually appear. He had not been prepared for Onyx to cross the hall and ask my name as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. "What does a protector actually feel?" I asked. The document was incomplete. Onyx considered his words before speaking. "A protector doesn't read intentions. She reads bond health, the living connective tissue between wolves. Every pack bond, every sworn alliance, every mate claim carries its own resonant frequency. When one is genuine, it is quiet. Stable, like a held breath that never needs to release." He paused. "When one is corrupted, forced, or built on a lie, she feels it as wrongness. Not metaphorically. The body registers it. The old records describe it differently by bloodline, cold settling at the back of the throat, a sound that exists just below hearing, like a string pulled too tight. The taste of something metallic on the tongue, arriving before the mind can name what it's perceiving. He set his hands flat on the table, as if grounding the words. The ability isn't comfortable to carry. It was never meant to be. It was meant to be true. I went completely still. The taste of copper. I had spent 3 years chalking it up to anxiety. To my own body betraying me the way I believed everything about me was slightly off, slightly wrong, slightly too much, slightly not enough. I had spent 3 years in Nolan's pack feeling that low, persistent wrongness and deciding it was mine. A defect. A symptom of being someone who didn't quite fit anywhere. Not a gift that no one had taught me to hold. I felt it constantly at Aldenmore. I said quietly. Something moved in Onyx's expression. Controlled quickly, but not before I caught it. Not pity. Something sharper than pity. The look of a man who has arrived too late to prevent damage but is absolutely clear about who caused it. I know, he said, and you stayed. I thought it was me. He looked at me across the table for a moment. Then, without ceremony, without any surrounding language, it was never you. 4 words. No performance in them. Just clean and certain, the way he said everything. I looked down at the table, then up. You want me here because of what I am, not only because of what happened last night. I want you here for both reasons. What happened last night was unjust. I would have acted regardless. He held my gaze. But yes, what you are makes your presence here something larger than justice. I've never been trained. I don't know how to use any of it deliberately. That's why you have time. Does Nolan know I'm here yet? Something moved through Onyx's expression. Not satisfaction exactly, but the adjacent quality of a man who has watched a specific thing happen at the exact moment he intended. By now, yes. I thought about Nolan standing in Aldenmore this morning, reading a message that the wolf he had publicly discarded had been received by the High Court. I thought about his face last night when Onyx crossed the hall. That first moment of something small and frightened opening in his expression like a crack in stone. I thought about 3 years of thread by thread, dream by dream. Good, I said. Onyx didn't smile, but something in the set of his expression settled in a way I was beginning to recognize. The way his face looked when something had finally arrived where it was supposed to be. The High Court was not a safe place for someone like me. I understood that within 3 days. Aldenmore's contempt had been blunt. The word unclaimable dropped like a coin into an empty room. The court's version was more refined, chairs consistently occupied when I entered a space, conversations concluding slightly too quickly. Names remembered and then, with precise social timing, allowed to be forgotten again. It was designed to make you feel optional, to make you question whether you'd been invited into a room or had simply walked in by mistake. Ellis was the exception. She moved through the compound with a quiet directness I came to rely on, setting down meals without commentary, meeting my eyes without calculation, occasionally pausing in the doorway as if she had something to say and choosing, each time, to let the silence carry it instead. I didn't press. I was grateful. Amelia arrived on my 5th morning. She was small, sharp-eyed, with the kind of economy of movement that belongs to people who have survived for a long time in worlds that didn't especially want them there. She looked at me without speaking when we first met, standing in the upper training chamber, the mountain cold seeping through the stone walls, and then said, "You already feel it. You just don't have a word for it." I thought it was anxiety, I said. The sound she made wasn't quite a laugh. It's perception. The protector line doesn't read thoughts. It reads bond health, the emotional and spiritual connective tissue between wolves. Every bond carries a frequency. When it's genuine, it's quiet. When it's corrupted, forced, false, built on a lie, you feel it. She studied me. What does it feel like to you specifically? I thought about every room at Aldenmore where I'd felt faintly wrong, like wearing something that doesn't fit. And sometimes, I paused. A taste, like copper, at the back of my throat, right before something that seems normal turns out not to be. Amelia nodded slowly. That's how it manifests in some bloodlines. The body makes it physical because the mind has been trained not to trust it. She looked at me steadily. You spent years calling that sensation yours. Deciding the problem was you. Yes. That, she said, is what happens when no one tells you what you are. The sessions were daily, disorienting in the way that important things often are, like learning to hear a frequency you've been told doesn't exist and realizing it has been sounding the entire time. Amelia didn't flatter me. She didn't treat the work as precious. She pushed, and when I got something right, she said so without ceremony and moved to the next thing. The more I learned, the more the 3 years at Aldenmore recontextualized themselves. Less like failure, more like evidence. Evidence I hadn't known how to read until now. Meanwhile, the court's undercurrent was sharpening. Maverick had begun holding private meetings with 2 of the council members. The pattern had the specific quality of coordination rather than conversation. Meetings that ended too abruptly when I passed. Topics that shifted too smoothly. I felt it the way Amelia had been teaching me to feel things. Not as suspicion, but as wrongness. That low copper and cold sensation I had spent years attributing to my own inadequacy. Not anymore. I told Onyx on the evening of my second week. We were in the archive room, him at the long table with territorial correspondence, me with the second protector document open to a section on historical case studies. I laid out what I had observed in sequence. The meeting patterns, the specific room dynamic shifts when I appeared, Maverick's behavioral tells when he registered my presence. Onyx listened without moving. "You're certain?" he said. Not a question. "It feels the same way Aldenmore felt," I said. "The same wrongness. Except here it has a direction. It's pointed at me specifically." Maverick's mandate was to monitor the moment I moved on the Protector bloodline investigation, and slow it, Onyx said. He has been feeding reports back to Aldenmore since his placement here. What I've been waiting for is evidence of which council members he recruited internally. That correspondence doesn't exist yet in written form. He paused. But if you can confirm the fractures in the room during a formal council session, the false alliances, the coordinated deception, that is evidence of a different kind. I looked at him. You want me to use it, formally? Only if you choose to. He said that often. Only if you choose to. Every time it landed differently from how it would have sounded coming from anyone else. Not a performance of respect. The actual thing. "I'll be in the session," I said. The opportunity came 3 days later, without announcement. The council was mid-session when I entered with Onyx, a formal hearing about a disputed territorial boundary between 2 outer packs. Standard, procedural. The kind of hearing designed to be forgettable. Except it wasn't. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt the room the way Amelia had been training me to feel rooms. Not as furniture and faces, but as a living map of bond states. And what I found inside that hearing was not a territorial dispute. One of the 2 pack representatives was lying. Not about the boundary itself, about his authority to negotiate it at all. His pack claim was false, a recent seizure rather than a legitimate inheritance. Every word he spoke carried the particular frequency of a bond structure built on coercion, and it pressed against my perception like cold air pressing against glass that hasn't yet cracked. But that wasn't what made my hands go still in my lap. The council member who already knew was worse. One of the five, seated beside Maverick, a wolf named Jetson with a careful and deliberately moderate face, was receiving the false claim with the studied neutrality of someone pretending to assess information they had been given in advance. His bond state was not conflicted. It was settled. He had made his decision before the hearing began. I leaned toward Onyx, low enough to be private. The representative is presenting a false bond claim. The council member on the right already knows it. This hearing has a predetermined outcome. Onyx didn't look at me. He didn't react visibly at all. He simply folded his hands on the table and said into the room, "Before we continue, I want the genealogical record of the current territory claim presented in full, including the original bond transfer documentation." The representative hesitated. One beat too long. Jetson went completely still. Maverick looked at me, and I held his gaze without flinching, because I was done looking at people who had been paid to make me feel uncertain and deciding, out of old habit, that they must have a point. The hearing was suspended. The documentation, when it arrived, confirmed everything I had felt. The false claim collapsed. Jetson was placed under formal inquiry before the session ended. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Onyx fell into step beside me. "You were precise," he said. "I had a good teacher." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was the first time a protector has acted in formal council session in 4 generations." I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I had been focused on the copper sensation and Jetson's too still face, on doing something useful. But he was right. Something had just shifted in the record of this court, in a room full of witnesses. "How does that feel?" he asked. I thought about the ivory gown folded in a chest I hadn't opened. About Nolan's voice not shaking when it should have. About every room at Aldenmore where I had stood at the edge, quiet, trying to take up as little space as possible. "Like fitting somewhere," I said. We walked in silence for a few steps. The corridor was narrow here, mountain stone close on both sides, the torch on the wall casting our shadows long and overlapping across the floor. "The formal council review is in 2 days," Onyx said. "Maverick's connection to the Aldenmore directive, the correspondence, the timeline, the internal recruitment, all of it will be presented." "I know. I'll need you there." A pause. "Not as a witness, as the protector of the High Court." Another pause, shorter. "If you're ready?" I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me. And in the torchlight, with the mountain stone close at his back and no audience, his expression had lost its usual composed distance. Just slightly. Just enough. I held his gaze. "I'm ready," I said. He nodded once, but he didn't look away immediately. And neither did I. The moment lasted 4 or 5 seconds and said nothing out loud and said everything else beneath that. The council review was held in the High Court's ceremonial chamber. It was the oldest room in the compound. Walls carved with the name of every king since the founding. The stone floor worn to a polish by 400 years of boots and consequence. The kind of room that holds everything that has happened in it, and refuses to let it go. The 5 council members were already seated when I entered at Onyx's right side. The elder stateswoman's expression shifted, once, barely, when she registered my position. Maverick looked up from the table and went absolutely still in the way people go still when a plan has finally arrived at its consequences, and there is nothing left to do but wait. I felt the room the moment I crossed the threshold. Dense. The bond health of everyone seated at that table was readable to me now with a clarity that would have frightened me 3 weeks ago. False alliances layered over each other like sediment. Old arrangements, quiet corruptions, coordinated silences held together by one simple fact. No one had ever been in this room who could perceive them. Until today. Onyx took his seat. I stood at his right. He opened the hearing without preamble. What followed was 2 hours of the most precise dismantling I had ever witnessed. Onyx didn't raise his voice. He presented documents, correspondence retrieved from Maverick's chamber, arranged in sequence, dated across 4 years. Instructions from Nolan's inner council. A standing directive to monitor and suppress the High Court's investigation into the Protector bloodline. The names of the council members who had coordinated with Maverick. The mechanism by which reports had been transmitted back to Aldenmore for 18 months. From inside this court, from the man seated at this table. The elder stateswoman attempted to reframe it. She was formidable, the kind of political intelligence that had survived decades by knowing precisely how far reality could be bent before it broke. But every reframe ran into the next document. Every alternative explanation collapsed against the next piece of evidence. And as the reframes crumbled, I felt the room change beneath it all. The false bond structure holding the arrangement together was loosening. I could feel it, that copper-cold pressure lifting. The way pressure lifts from a sealed room when a door finally opens. The coordination that had kept this corruption invisible was unraveling in real time. And each person in it was quietly, separately, recalibrating what came next. Leo was the first to speak outside the formal proceeding. He pushed his chair back slightly and said quietly, "This has gone far enough." Everyone looked at him. "The Protector line's suppression was never court law," he continued. "It was a private arrangement between Aldenmore's leadership and individual members of this body. It has no legal standing. It should never have had any." He looked at me directly. "I'm sorry." The elder stateswoman closed her eyes briefly. Maverick said nothing for the remainder of the session. He looked at the table in front of him and did not raise his eyes. By the time the hearing concluded, 2 council members had been formally removed. A complete restoration of the Protector line's historical record was ordered. Every erasure to be reversed in the official archives. And a sealed letter was drafted and sent south by High Court messenger. Nolan would receive it before morning. He arrived 4 days later. Onyx told me simply, without inflection. "Nolan has petitioned for a formal hearing. He's citing the bond rejection as a matter requiring council review. He claims you were removed from Aldenmore against your will." I understood immediately. He wants access to whatever he thinks I've become. Yes, he believes the Protector bloodline is a power he can acquire through proximity, or through reinstating the bond. He doesn't understand what it is at all. "No," Onyx said, "he doesn't." The thought settled between us. The possibility of a bond reinstatement. The old pull, the 3-year habit, the part of me that had spent so long waiting to finally be chosen. I waited for it to appear. It didn't. I couldn't name the exact moment it had left. Maybe during Amelia's sessions, when she had named what I was, and it had felt like being handed back a piece of myself I'd been told didn't exist. Maybe at the council hearing, when I had stood in that old chamber and done something, and the room had reorganized itself around the fact of me. Maybe in a dozen smaller moments. Onyx asking my opinion and then actually listening, Ellis's genuine nod in the corridor, the accumulating weight of being somewhere that didn't require my presence to be managed. The pull was gone. In its place was something quieter and considerably more permanent. The final hearing was held in the ceremonial courtyard, not a chamber. Outside, open sky, stone flags, the ancient iron torches that had stood at this compound since the founding. Present were Onyx, the remaining council members, Amelia, 2 court witnesses, and Leo, who had requested to attend. And me. Nolan arrived the way people arrive when they have rehearsed. He was still compelling to look at. That was simply the physics of him. But something in his bearing had compressed. Something that had been certainty and had curdled into something harder and less stable. He looked at me the moment he entered the courtyard, and I watched his face move through several rapid calculations. He had expected grief. He had expected the wolf he left at the altar, uncertain, hoping one well-placed gesture from forgiving him. He found me standing at Onyx's right side, hands folded, spine straight, with an expression that I imagine, from the outside, looked like complete peace. For just a moment, before the calculation reasserted itself, before the prepared argument arranged itself back behind his eyes, something else crossed his face. Something unguarded. Not love, not remorse exactly, but the particular look of a person who has just understood, in the space of a single second, the full size of what they discarded. It was there, and then it was gone, buried under the practiced composure of a man who had come here with a plan and intended to execute it. That flash was not enough. It would never be enough. But I saw it. And I noted, with a kind of quiet precision, that it had arrived too late to mean anything at all. He opened his formal argument. Bond law, historical precedent for rejection reversal in cases of perceived external pressure. A constructed narrative in which I had been removed from Aldenmore before properly processing the rejection and therefore denied due process. He was fluent. He had clearly prepared. His legal architecture was technically coherent. None of it moved anything in the room. I was watching him while he spoke, and I could feel, clearly, without effort, the precise architecture of his motivation. It was not love. It had never been love. It was strategy encountering an outcome it hadn't anticipated, arriving with carefully chosen language designed to reverse the miscalculation. He wasn't here for me. He was here for what he now understood I represented. When he finished, Onyx responded first, concisely, legally, finally. The High Court found no basis for reversal. The rejection had been formally enacted and publicly witnessed. The bond was dissolved. The petition had no standing. Then Onyx did something I would carry with me long after that courtyard, long after that morning. He didn't simply offer me the floor. He stood, fully, from his seat in the oldest courtyard in the kingdom, with the names of every king carved into the walls behind him. And he said, "The protector of the High Court may speak. Not Kayla. Not you may say something if you'd like. The protector of the High Court. A title. Spoken aloud, formally, by the sovereign of the kingdom, in front of witnesses." Nolan stared. I could feel the exact moment it landed, the understanding of what it meant, arriving in him the way cold water arrives, all at once and impossible to unfeel. The woman he had rejected at the altar 3 weeks ago now stood in this courtyard with a title older than his family's pack claim on Aldenmore. A title his council had spent 6 generations working to prevent anyone in her bloodline from ever holding. Too late. I looked at him. I looked for a long moment because I wanted to be certain of what I found, and what I found confirmed everything I already knew. There was no love in his presence. Not even the fractured remnant that lingers when something real ends badly. There was strategy. There was shock. There was the particular corrosive quality of a man who destroyed something extraordinary and is now watching the rubble become a foundation. And there was regret. Not the kind that leads to change. The kind that arrives after all the doors are already closed and simply has to be lived with. I let the silence hold for one breath. "The girl who needed your approval no longer exists," I said. He stared. "I spent 3 years making myself smaller so you could feel larger. I mistook your silence for discretion. I mistook your strategy for something that belonged to me. And when the fates offered you something real, something that would have asked you to be more than what you were, you called it an inconvenience. I held his gaze. I don't say this with anger. I say it with complete clarity. You were never the measure of me. I just believed you were for too long. He opened his mouth. The woman who stands here now, I said, was always who I was. You didn't create her by leaving. You just couldn't stop her from arriving. I turned. I walked toward the open end of the courtyard, toward the mountain, toward the sky, toward the life that had been quietly building itself around me for the past 3 weeks, asking only that I keep showing up and stop pretending I was less than I was. Not with performance, not with drama, with the simple, uncomplicated movement of a person who knows where she is going. Behind me, the silence was absolute. I had almost reached the far end of the courtyard when I heard him. Not Nolan. Onyx. He didn't call out. He didn't raise his voice. He simply fell into step beside me, appearing at my left shoulder with that particular quiet that was entirely his. And we walked the last stretch of courtyard together without speaking. The morning sky wide and pale above the mountain's edge. The torch smoke rising straight in the still air. At the courtyard's end, where the stone path turned toward the mountain overlook, we stopped. I looked out at the territory below, the compound, the forest beyond it, the distant pale line where the mountain met the sky. I was aware of him beside me, of the fact that he had stood up when he named me, that he had let me walk away from Nolan without following, and then followed anyway. Not to retrieve me, not to manage the moment, but simply to be present in it. There was a long quiet. Then Onyx said, "The archive has a northern section most people never find. The documents there go back further than anything in the primary collection." A pause. I've been saving it. I didn't know for whom until recently. I turned and looked at him. His expression was its usual composed self, but there was something in it I had learned to read over the past weeks. That subtle relaxation at the edges that appeared when there was no audience, no proceeding, no political terrain being navigated. When it was only the two of us, and he wasn't performing anything. "Is that an invitation?" I asked. "It is," he said. Then quieter. "It has been for a while." I looked back at the mountain, looked at the sky. "Then yes," I said. We stood there a moment longer in the morning quiet, side by side. Not touching, not declaring anything. Just present, in the same space, with everything that had happened between the altar and this courtyard hanging in the air around us like something that hadn't yet decided what shape to take. It was enough, more than enough. It was the beginning of something that would take its own time, and neither of us was in a hurry to name it before it was ready. Kayla's story ends where it began, in a courtyard, before witnesses, with her name in the air. But the second time, she was the one who held it. There is something quietly devastating about understanding that the people who kept you invisible were afraid. Not of your weakness, of your power. The ones who called you unclaimable. They could see exactly what you would become if you ever stopped believing their version of you. That is why they worked so hard to make sure you did. Rejection is brutal. Public humiliation is real. The kind of deliberate erasure this story describes leaves marks that don't simply fade on their own. What Kayla had to unlearn, the habit of waiting to be chosen, the reflex of making herself smaller, the belief that the wrongness she felt was her own. That was not healed in a single night. It was worked through, slowly, in stone chambers and training sessions, and small moments where someone treated her presence like it mattered. That is the part that doesn't make the highlight reel, but it is the work. Here is what I want you to hold. The moment you hand someone else the authority to determine your worth, you give them a power they were never qualified to carry. Nolan didn't destroy Kayla's value. He revealed that he had never understood it. There is a profound difference between those two things. And recognizing that difference, Understanding that his failure to see you was never evidence of what you are is one of the most liberating realizations a person can arrive at. She didn't need him to change his mind. She needed to stop waiting for it. The worst day of her life was not the end of her story. It was the doorway to the life she was actually meant to live. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? Was it the courtyard? The archive? The hearing? Or the quiet walk at the end? I read every single one. And if you made it here, you already know what this channel is. Subscribe and stay close. The next story is already coming. This is Adeline's Story Vault, where the best stories find you.